Some mysteries do not whisper from the dark. They echo from the silence that follows. It begins at a snowbound abbey where faith and guilt have woven a machinery of death, and even the toll of a distant bell carries the weight of a conscience unconfessed. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us walk beside Holmes into that frozen courtyard, and listen for the sound that reason cannot explain. It was one of those nights in Baker Street when the very air seemed reluctant to rest. A sharp December wind prowled along the chimneys and whispered through the seams of the window panes, carrying with it the restless mutter of the city beyond. Holmes sat opposite me before the fire, his lean figure framed in the glow of the coals, his eyes fixed on some invisible horizon of thought. There was in his manner that peculiar tension I had learned to recognize, a stillness before action, like a violin string drawn taut before the bow. He had spoken little that evening, though the pipe at his side had long since gone cold. I knew that behind that motionless exterior, the machinery of his mind was stirring, measuring the pulse of London itself. Every creak of the settling house, every stray cry from the street, seemed to find a place in that silent calculation. The night, in truth, belonged to him, and yet I felt it waiting for something neither of us could name. Our conversation, when it came, drifted as naturally as the smoke that curled toward the ceiling. Holmes had spoken of the curious persistence of belief, how in even the most civilized age, the shadow of superstition walks hand in hand with reason. Man, he said, may light his cities with gas and govern his life by science, yet he listens still for whispers in the dark. As if summoned by that very thought, a faint toll reached us from afar. A single church bell struck somewhere in the labyrinth of London streets. Its note lingered, thin and melancholy, before dissolving into the wind. Holmes looked up sharply, his eyes bright with some private amusement. "There," he murmured, "is the very sound of conscience, Watson. A bell does not mourn the dead. It accuses the living." He fell again into silence, his face half in shadow, half in flame. The room seemed to absorb the echo, and I, against reason, felt a tremor of unease. The city was full of noise, yet that one, solitary toll had seemed directed at us alone. Not long after, a brisk knock disturbed our reflection. Mrs. Hudson appeared, bearing an envelope whose red wax seal bore the impression of a cross entwined with ivy. The handwriting upon it was deliberate and ecclesiastical, the kind one associates with clerks or men of long study. Holmes took it with that keen flicker of interest I knew so well, weighing it upon his palm before breaking the seal. "From Canterbury Street," he observed. "That district lies near the offices of several religious foundations, and one or two less reputable societies for the conversion of sinners." His tone carried that peculiar mixture of irony and respect with which he approached matters of faith. Within was a short note, in an uneven hand. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes is entreated to lend his reason to a matter of divine confusion." Below it, pinned with care, lay a scrap of newsprint, its edges yellowed by age. Holmes read both in silence, his brows drawing together. I caught the faint twitch of a smile, less of amusement than of recognition. "A summons of a different order, Watson," he said softly, "and one, I suspect, that comes not from heaven, but from the human heart." Holmes held the clipping nearer the light. It was from a provincial paper, dated only a week prior, reporting on a curious matter in the countryside. Unaccountable tolling of bells at Winter Abbey, local superstition revived. Beneath the headline, a few lines described that ancient monastery, now home to a handful of monks who claimed to hear the bells ring without mortal touch, each peal preceding some calamity within their order. The words, spare though they were, seemed to fill the room with a chill older than the winter outside. Holmes's fingers tightened upon the paper. For a moment neither of us spoke. I could almost hear the echo of those spectral bells through the silence between us. At length, he rose and began to pace. A legend, perhaps, or a deception practiced under the guise of faith. Yet I have often found that the most blasphemous crimes hide beneath sacred roofs. His tone was neither mocking nor irreverent, only grave. The gaslight flickered against his profile, and I thought that even his shadow appeared thoughtful. Something had stirred in him that was both intellectual and instinctive, as if an unseen hand had drawn him toward the sound of those bells. Holmes sank once more into his chair, spreading the clipping across his knee. I watched his expression sharpen into that keen stillness that was the outward sign of mental activity at its height. He read and reread the few lines, then closed his eyes, as if testing their rhythm upon memory. "The bells," he murmured, "ring when no man moves the rope. Yet all machinery, Watson, be it of flesh or of iron, obeys a cause. Either we are faced with a trick of engineering, or with a crime conducted under cover of sanctity. But mark this: they toll for none, and yet they toll. Therefore they toll for someone who has not yet died." His voice had fallen to a whisper, and I could not tell whether the last words were addressed to me or to himself. The fire hissed softly upon the hearth, and for the first time that evening I sensed in my friend not triumph, but something resembling foreboding. Outside, the wind had risen to a long, mournful pitch, moaning through the chimneys as though the city itself were in lament. I drew the curtain aside. The street below was deserted, a thin mist drifting between the lamps like pale smoke from some invisible fire. Holmes stood at the window beside me, his reflection wavering in the glass. "Listen," he said, and indeed there was a distant vibration, a mingling of gust and echo, that seemed almost to carry a note within it. "Nature herself," he added quietly, "is sometimes the accomplice of man's delusion." He turned back to the hearth, his face unreadable in the flickering light. There was something in the air, an expectancy, or perhaps a warning, that neither of us could shake. I felt, irrationally, that the night was listening, and that some message was already on its way to us through the cold and fog. The mantel clock had just struck 2 when a sudden knock startled us both. Holmes, who had been half reclined with closed eyes, was instantly alert. Mrs. Hudson reappeared, this time bearing a folded telegram. Its paper was still damp from the fog. Holmes tore it open, his eyes moving swiftly across the brief message. For an instant, I thought I saw his features harden, though his tone remained level when he read aloud. "The bells ring for the dead who are yet to die. Abbot, Winter Abbey." The words seemed to hang in the room like smoke. Holmes laid the telegram upon the table and regarded it in silence. Then, with that sudden animation which always followed discovery, he said, "Pack your valise, Watson. There is a train for Kent at 7. If these bells do indeed toll for the living, we may yet learn for whom." Outside, the wind gave a low, hollow moan, as if echoing the summons. Thus began the case of the bells of Winter Abbey. We left Victoria Station beneath a sky of iron. The air was sharp enough to draw breath through one's teeth, and flakes of snow drifted like pale embers through the drifting steam of the departing trains. Holmes, wrapped in his long grey overcoat and muffler, spoke scarcely a word. He leaned upon his cane, eyes narrowed toward the east as if calculating the distance between reason and its test. I could not shake from my mind the uncanny phrasing of that telegram. "The bells ring for the dead who are yet to die." The rattle of the train seemed to echo its rhythm. Around us, passengers hurried to warmer destinations, their laughter sounding strangely brittle in the cold. Holmes remained motionless until the whistle blew, and even then his silence was not one of apathy, but of inward absorption. As we took our seats, I ventured some remark upon the weather. He only glanced at the window, where the first flurries met the glass, and murmured, "It is the kind of day, Watson, when even the wind carries confession." While our train idled for its final passengers, a porter approached to stow our luggage, his hands blue from the cold. Seeing the address upon our trunk, he hesitated. "Winter Abbey, sir?" he asked, lowering his voice. "They say the bells there toll for their own." Holmes's eyes gleamed with faint amusement. "And what, my good man, Does that mean in your philosophy? The porter shuffled, uneasy. Only that each time they've rung, death's followed close behind. A monk first, then a pilgrim, and last the abbot's own kin. No man dares go near the tower now. Holmes thanked him with grave courtesy and pressed a coin into his palm. When the man departed, he turned to me with the faintest trace of a smile. Observe, Watson, how superstition thrives best in the frost. The human mind, deprived of warmth, invents its own fire. I said nothing. The whistle shrieked. As the train pulled from the platform, the porter's figure blurred into the drifting snow, his words lingering like a chill upon the air. The journey southward unfolded through a landscape reduced to abstraction. Fields, trees, hedgerows, all had vanished beneath a mantle of white. It was as though the world had been erased and rewritten in silence. Holmes sat opposite me, the newspaper unread upon his knee, his gaze fixed beyond the window pane where no feature broke the monotony of snow. At length he spoke, more to himself than to me. Note, Watson, how easily the mind supplies what the senses deny. When man beholds a void, he fills it, with fear, with faith, with memory. The bells of Winter Abbey are no different. The sound may be of his own making. The words seemed to hang in the still compartment, like frost. I watched him, fascinated by the delicate balance between intellect and imagination that defined him. Outside, the wind swept across the fields, and in that deep hush I fancied, though reason forbade it, that I heard a faint metallic resonance carried upon the air, distant yet deliberate, like the memory of a bell that had not yet rung. Holmes stirred, his eyes flickering to mine. "You heard it too, then," he said quietly. We broke our journey at a small hostelry that crouched beside a frozen hollow road, its signboard creaking faintly in the wind. Inside, a single fire burned low, and the landlord, a pale, hollow-cheeked man, welcomed us with an eagerness born of solitude rather than hospitality. When Holmes mentioned our destination, the man's expression altered at once. "You'll find no warmth at Winter Abbey, gentlemen," he said gravely. "The bells there are cursed. They sound when souls are chosen. I heard them once myself." Holmes encouraged him gently. The story came haltingly. "It was the year my brother died. A night like this, bitter as judgment. The bells tolled thrice before dawn. Next morning they found him under the ice near the mill pond. His face—" The man broke off, eyes fixed on the embers. "No mortal hand rang those bells, sir. I swear it." Holmes's gaze softened, though his voice remained even. The imagination, when bereaved, becomes a clairvoyant thing. It reads meaning where only pattern lies. Yet as we took our leave, I saw him glance toward the inn's frosted window, as though testing the air for that unseen vibration the landlord had described. Outside, the wind carried a sound like distant breathing. By the time we reached the next village, rumour had run ahead of us. Every face we met bore the same uneasy reverence, as though the Abbey itself were a sentient being. Holmes, ever the skeptic, moved among them like a physician taking the pulse of an epidemic. In the village square, he questioned a gathering of labourers, drawing from each the same tale. The bells that tolled before misfortune, the cold that thickened after each peal. "Superstition," he observed to me afterward, "is the most contagious of maladies. Observe how one man's dread becomes another's doctrine." Still, I noted a peculiar tension in him. His manner was calm, his reasoning precise, yet his eyes betrayed a faint gleam of unease. As we took our seats in the waiting carriage, I ventured to remark upon it. He smiled faintly. "Even the mind most armoured by reason, Watson, is not wholly proof against suggestion. Fear, you see, is a splendid instrument. It measures belief better than any gauge of mine." His words lingered with me as the horses began their climb toward the ridge. Somewhere ahead, hidden by snow and cloud, lay the Abbey that had taught men to hear death before it came. The afternoon had deepened into storm when we reached the crest. Below us stretched the valley, pale and soundless, save for the whisper of falling snow. There, half buried in drifts and solitude, stood Winter Abbey, a mass of stone so black it seemed to absorb the very light. Holmes raised his field glass, studying the outline of the structure. "The belfry, Watson. Observe how the upper apertures are sealed with mortar. No wind could enter there, no hand could climb." Indeed, the tower stood mute and mutilated, its bells imprisoned by time. Yet even as he spoke, a faint vibration stirred the air, a low, tremulous hum that seemed to pass through the bones rather than the ear. Holmes lowered the glass. "An illusion of the gale," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. The wind bit at our faces as we descended the path. Every step drew us nearer to that dark silhouette against the snow. I glanced at my companion, but his gaze was fixed ahead, his expression one of almost reverent concentration. When we reached the frozen gates, the air seemed charged with an expectancy I could not name. Then, from the tower above, came a single, lingering note. It was a sound neither shrill nor deep, but vast, rolling through the valley as though the air itself were struck. I felt it vibrate within my chest, a resonance too deliberate for mere wind. Holmes stood motionless, head slightly inclined, as if listening to the argument of nature itself. "The storm plays strange tricks upon acoustics," he said at last, but I could tell the words were armor, not conviction. The note faded, leaving behind a silence almost heavier than sound. Snow fell thicker now, wrapping the Abbey in a spectral shroud. As we passed beneath the gate, I sensed that each step brought us further from the realm of reason and deeper into one of memory and conscience. Holmes's features had set into that expression of austere determination which heralded his finest inquiries. "Mark it well, Watson," he said softly. "If no living hand rang that bell, then we are in pursuit not of death, but of its echo." The wind rose, scattering the flakes between us like ashes. Ahead, the Abbey waited, and with it the mystery that had already begun to toll in our minds. We passed beneath the great archway of Winter Abbey as the snow thickened, muting the world into white silence. The abbot awaited us at the gate, a tall, ascetic figure whose trembling hand rose in benediction, his breath misting the frozen air. Above us, 2 iron bells hung crossed upon the stone, mute relics of an age that had long since ceased to sing. Holmes's gaze went immediately upward. The faintest narrowing of his eyes betrayed his calculation. Even before we had entered, his mind was mapping the mystery from tower to tomb. The abbot's blessing faltered when he perceived our attention. "They have not rung since the ceiling," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind, "yet they are heard still." His words carried the weight of both superstition and sorrow. As the gates groaned shut behind us, I felt the air grow colder, as though the silence itself possessed a soul. Holmes adjusted his collar and murmured, "When sound is forbidden, Watson, truth must find subtler means of speech." Within the cloister, the hush was of an order I had never known. No human murmur disturbed it, only the soft scrape of sandals upon stone and the faint rhythm of breath in prayer. The place seemed carved not merely from rock, but from restraint itself. Holmes, who could discern eloquence even in absence, watched the monks pass with analytical curiosity. "Silence," he whispered, "is rarely imposed to honor holiness. More often, it conceals the nature of men." His words hung between us, at once irreverent and profoundly true. The chill seeped deeper as we followed the abbot through a labyrinth of narrow corridors. The light, filtering through high windows, fell in thin, dusted shafts upon the stone floor. The scent of wax and damp parchment filled the air. We were led at last into a long refectory where a single candle burned beside a wooden crucifix. The abbot gestured for us to wait while he summoned the record of deaths. Holmes's expression did not alter, yet I sensed the quiet ignition of his purpose. The silence of Winter Abbey was no longer holy, it was suspect. When the abbot returned, he carried a small ledger bound in cracked leather. His hands shook as he laid it upon the table, the candlelight quivering upon his face. "3 of our number," he said softly. have departed this world since the new year. Each death was preceded by a single toll from the sealed belfry. Holmes inclined his head but spoke no word. The abbot continued, his voice brittle with weariness. Brother Andrew was found first, kneeling in the chapel. Then Brother Thomas, whose vigil ended at the hour of matins. And lastly, Brother Gregory, our most devout, discovered lifeless upon the cloister steps, his hands folded as though in absolution. I glanced at Holmes. His eyes, bright yet remote, studied the page of dates and times the abbot indicated. Each death before dawn, he murmured, each toll between 2 and 3. Remarkable precision for the workings of heaven. The abbot's pallor deepened. You mock the faith, Mr. Holmes. On the contrary, my friend replied with quiet gravity. I test its endurance. He closed the ledger gently. When death keeps to a schedule, it is not eternity we must question, but the clock. The abbot crossed himself, as though to ward off thought itself. Holmes requested to meet the survivors. The abbot hesitated, then assented, and one by one they entered the chamber, 3 figures bound by fear and obedience. Brother Martin, the bell-keeper of former days, was first, a heavy man whose eyes avoided ours. His coarse hands twitched upon his robe as he muttered that the tower was cursed since the ceiling. No rope hangs there now, sir, yet they ring, he said, with the conviction of one who has ceased to doubt. Brother Elias followed, a lean, nervous man with fingers stained by the tinctures of his apothecary work. His speech was precise but guarded, his gaze too often flicking toward the abbot. Faith, he said, is not built upon mechanism. Holmes noted the remark without reply. Last came Sister Ruth, the Abbey's nurse. She was young, pale, and visibly exhausted. Her eyes, grey, unflinching, betrayed a depth of feeling unspoken in that austere place. When Holmes addressed her, she hesitated only once before replying, I have heard the bells, sir, but not with my ears. Holmes inclined his head. Then perhaps, sister, it is not the air that carries the sound, but the conscience. The faintest tremor crossed her lips before she turned away. After long persuasion, the abbot led us to the mortuary, a small stone chamber beneath the chapel where candles flickered beside 3 linen-covered forms. The air was thick with incense and decay. Holmes bent over the 3rd body, that of Brother Gregory. His hands moved with the delicate precision of a surgeon. Observe, Watson, he said quietly. The nails, broken slightly. The neck, faint bruising, symmetrical. These are not the tokens of peaceful resignation. The abbot murmured a protest, but Holmes continued, lifting the monk's hands. No burns, no markings of restraint, yet the throat bears the impression of pressure. Steady, calculated. This man died not by divine summons, but by human interference. I felt a chill that was not of the crypt. Holmes replaced the covering and straightened, his face composed but cold. Tell me, Abbot, were these monks alone in prayer before they died? They were, came the whispered reply. Then the murderer is either the spirit that haunts this place, Holmes said, or one who walks unseen in its habit. The abbot made the sign of the cross. Holmes only bowed slightly, as though before a mystery older than himself. Later, when the others had withdrawn, Holmes and I traversed the cloisters by candlelight. The corridors breathed cold air like a living organism. Along the stone, faint streaks of soot caught the flame. Holmes knelt, examining them with quick precision. Candle smoke, he said, tracing the marks, but not from devotional use. Observe, the residue lies low upon the wall, consistent with a hand-held taper moving furtively, not a candelabrum upon an altar. The blackened trail led us through the passage toward the stair that once ascended to the belfry. There, abruptly, it ended. The wall ahead was bare and pale. Holmes ran his fingers over the stone and frowned. No draught, no mark of entry, yet someone stood here long enough to leave a trace of soot. He turned the candle so that its flame wavered, throwing long shadows upon the vault above us. "It is as if the culprit vanished mid-step," I murmured. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "No, Watson, not vanished, concealed. The difference, as ever, is the key to everything." The candle hissed softly, its light diminishing as though the Abbey itself exhaled upon it. We emerged once more into the outer court. The snow had fallen anew, lying thin as parchment upon the stone walk. Holmes stooped almost at once, his keen gaze fixed upon a line of impressions barely visible in the frost. "Human," he said, his voice low. "Booted, not sandaled. Weight distributed unevenly. Perhaps a limp." He followed the pattern with swift, silent precision, the lamplight glinting on the frost as we moved along the cloister's arc. The prints led us in a gentle curve, then straightened toward the tower door, ancient, sealed, unbroken. There they ended, as though the earth had swallowed their maker whole. Holmes examined the lock, brushed away the frost, and tapped upon the stone surrounding it. The sound was dull, lifeless. "The belfry has not opened in half a century," I said. And yet someone," Holmes interrupted softly, "has stood before this door within the hour." He rose, his expression unreadable, the faint ghost of a deduction stirring behind his eyes. "A man walks through silence, leaves marks that vanish, and rouses bells that none may touch. Either we pursue a phantom, Watson, or a mind subtle enough to make one." The wind swept through the cloister, carrying with it a sound almost like distant metal. Holmes's eyes lifted to the tower. "Whichever it is," he murmured, "the answer waits above." The abbot's composure faltered at last when Holmes requested the means of entry. From within the folds of his robe, he drew forth a rusted key upon a chain, its surface rough with verdigris. His hands shook as though from cold, though the air of the cloister was still. "No man," he whispered, "has entered the belfry since it was sealed. The bells toll by will not our own." Holmes took the key between finger and thumb, turning it toward the light. "Iron may corrode, Abbot, but habit leaves subtler marks. Observe." He pointed to faint, fresh abrasions along the teeth, scratches too recent to belong to decades past. The abbot's eyes widened, his mouth working without sound. Holmes replaced the key gently. "If your order forbids deceit, then perhaps it is the tower itself which lies," he said quietly. I saw in the abbot's trembling form a man torn between faith and dread. As we turned toward the stair, Holmes's voice softened almost to pity. "Even holy walls, Watson, cannot bar the hand of reason or of guilt." The stairway that wound upward from the cloister was scarcely wide enough for one man's shoulders. Our lantern's dim flame threw shifting halos upon the curved walls, revealing the patient work of centuries, stone worn to satin by feet-long dust. The air grew colder with every turn, thick with the scent of dust, incense, and slow decay. Holmes ascended before me, his hand brushing the masonry with delicate precision, as though he read the tower's story through touch. The silence was of that oppressive kind which grows alive within itself. Each breath seemed to echo like trespass. Once, far below, a door creaked and was still. Holmes paused mid-step, listening, then resumed without comment. I marveled, as always, at the singular courage of his curiosity, that relentless need to look into the darkest chambers of the human design. At last, the stair ended in an arch sealed by an ancient oak door. Holmes inserted the key, and the lock yielded with a sigh, as if resentful of intrusion. "You may yet find," he said with faint irony, "that superstition hides better mechanics than faith." The hinges groaned. Stale air drifted forth like the breath of time. The chamber above lay steeped in shadows. Our lantern revealed 4 bells hanging in solemn repose, their bronze faces furred with cobweb and time. The dust lay thick upon every beam and stone, yet the air vibrated faintly, as though memory itself had left its pulse behind. Holmes approached the nearest bell, and laid a hand upon its flank. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Still warmth within the metal. Recent disturbance, perhaps by resonance." He rapped it lightly, and the note that followed was faint but pure, trembling through the chamber like a sigh of confession. I felt the hairs rise upon my neck. Surely no man could have— "No visible man, perhaps," he corrected. "But the evidence suggests a hand both deliberate and informed." He turned his gaze upward to where the ropes disappeared into the gloom above. "Dust remembers, Watson. Even silence records." The bells loomed over us, monstrous and still, their mouths dark as tombs. It seemed to me that they listened, not waited. Holmes's expression had sharpened into that fierce absorption I knew so well, the look of a man who stands upon the verge of understanding and dreads what lies beyond it. Holmes's lantern illuminated the wooden framework from which the ropes descended. At first glance they appeared relics of neglect, frayed, discoloured, and stiff with age. Yet as Holmes ran the light across them, the truth emerged in detail. The upper fibres were darkened by oil, the lower ends faintly worn, as if fingers, or tools, had passed over them recently. He knelt, his magnifier glinting in the lamplight. "Note the consistency, Watson. Vegetable oil mixed with graphite dust, an unholy marriage of devotion and engineering." I watched him trace one rope's length with careful fingers. His face grew grave. "Someone has rethreaded these pulleys. The motion would require no man within the tower. It could be achieved from below, concealed, timed, and left to simulate the divine." His words chilled me more than the air. "Then these tollings were composed," he finished softly, "as one might compose music." The ropes hung between us like relics of conscience, each fibre seeming to whisper of guilt. Holmes's expression hardened into quiet disgust. "It is no ghost that moves these bells, Watson, but a man who wishes to be one." The lantern flame wavered, throwing the ropes into uneasy motion, as though they stirred to his accusation. Near the base of the frame, Holmes's boot brushed against a plank that yielded slightly beneath his weight. He stooped, pried it loose with his knife, and revealed beneath it a layer of fine grey dust. "Ash," he murmured, "but not of wood." He touched a pinch to his tongue, a habit I could never behold without discomfort. "Magnesium," he said at last, "combustible, brilliant, and most unnatural in a place of prayer." He raised his gaze toward the bells above. "Burnt for light? Or concealment?" "No, used to ignite something far more complex." I bent closer. The ash glimmered faintly in the lantern glow, mingled with particles of soot. Holmes's nostrils flared as he inhaled the scent. Chemical, not devotional. Here lies the residue of human ingenuity misused, faith wedded to the fever of invention. He replaced the plank gently, his expression thoughtful. The line between science and sacrilege grows perilously thin when the motive is guilt. The abbot's words from earlier returned to my mind. They are heard still. I wondered if it was not heaven, but man's conscience that had found its own method of tolling. Holmes straightened, brushing his hands. "Come, Watson. The dead do not burn magnesium, but an engineer might." A faint tang hung upon the air, sharp, metallic, unmistakably foreign to the stone's natural damp. I mentioned it to Holmes, who nodded at once. "Lubricant," he said. "Industrial grade, likely containing whale oil and powdered graphite. Rarely encountered outside scientific workshops or engineering firms." He knelt once more, passing his lantern beneath the bell frame. There, gleaming faintly in the half-light, lay the residue of a fine black dust. "Gear shavings," he added. "Minute, precisely tooled. This tower, Watson, has been less a place of worship than a laboratory of deception." He stood, eyes narrowing. Imagine it. The sound of death conjured not by providence, but by timed release and hidden mechanism. To deceive faith itself, there is genius here, but genius turned inwards upon corruption. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, The wind moaned softly through some unseen aperture, carrying with it the scent of rust and winter. I felt the unease of one who stands between worlds, faith and reason, life and machine. Holmes's face was pale. "Whoever made this," he said quietly, "did not merely mock heaven. He tried to replace it." Holmes had been about to speak further when the entire chamber seemed to quiver. A deep vibration trembled through the floorboards, subtle at first, then rising until every beam appeared to breathe. I froze, lantern held aloft. From somewhere above, the smallest of sounds gathered into shape. A single, perfect note. It was the bell. The toll rolled outward, vast and hollow, filling the tower, the Abbey, the night itself. Dust cascaded from the rafters like falling ashes. The air throbbed with sound so pure it felt almost human, a voice without source. Neither of us had moved. Holmes's expression, caught in the dim glow, was one of fascination touched by horror. "There," he said hoarsely, "is our murderer's art." When the final echo died, silence fell heavier than before. Holmes's hand rested upon the bell rope, unmoved. He drew it back, showing it slack and inert. Not by man, not now. The mechanism persists, even when the motive sleeps. Outside, a gust of wind swept through the cracks, carrying the faintest aftersound, half echo, half heartbeat. Holmes turned to me, his voice barely audible. "The hand that built this, Watson, has found a way to make the dead speak." The lantern flickered once, then steadied, burning pale against the dark. The abbot led us downward through a stair so narrow that our shoulders brushed the damp walls. Each step descended not merely through stone, but through centuries, the air thick with the mingled scent of wax and sanctity. The chill deepened as we went, until even our breath seemed heavy with reverence. Holmes walked beside me in silence, his lantern casting uneven halos upon the walls where inscriptions, half effaced by time, murmured of penance and death. The stairway twisted like a wound through the earth, until at last it widened into a chamber vast and still as eternity. The crypt opened before us, a place of cold majesty, lined with effigies of the departed. The air there was stagnant, as though it had ceased to move when the last monk was buried. The abbot paused, his trembling hand raised toward the stone altar. Holmes's gaze swept the vault with that peculiar blend of reverence and scrutiny that marked him in the presence of mystery. "Remarkable," he whispered, "a temple to silence itself." The abbot bowed his head. "And yet, Mr. Holmes," he murmured, "it is silence that has betrayed us." Upon a slab of cold marble lay the three bodies, draped in linen and illuminated by a single flickering taper. Their faces were serene, almost devotional, yet some darker truth clung about them, as if peace had been imposed rather than earned. Holmes drew nearer, the faint scrape of his boots the only intrusion upon the sacred quiet. He examined each form in turn, his movements deliberate, reverent, yet as precise as a surgeon's cut. "Note, Watson," he murmured, "the symmetry, each placed identically, hands crossed, head inclined, feet aligned. Death has been choreographed." I bent closer to the nearest corpse. Beneath the pallor of the skin, a faint bruising encircled the throat. It was neither livid nor irregular, but pale and even, as though imprinted by a hand too measured for violence. The abbot crossed himself. "No man touched them after death, Doctor. We found them thus." Holmes straightened slowly. "No man," he repeated, eyes narrowing, "or no living one?" The question lingered in the air, cold and unwelcome. The flame wavered, throwing the dead into fleeting motion, as if they stirred to answer. Holmes's scrutiny of the marks was meticulous. Kneeling beside the third corpse, he adjusted the lantern's light, revealing the bruises in their full, dreadful clarity. "Observe," he said quietly. "Each indentation mirrors its twin, not the erratic clutch of struggle, but the uniform grip of precision. He placed his fingertips lightly upon the flesh, tracing the faint arcs with analytical care. A mechanism, Watson. No man's fingers could apply such equal pressure upon opposite sides. The force is distributed evenly, suggestive of clamps or levers, and yet there is no tearing of tissue, controlled strength, not passion. I felt a chill deeper than the crypt's air. Then the killer was aided by machinery. Holmes glanced at me, his expression grave. By machinery, or by mind. In the end, they are seldom apart. He rose, brushing the dust from his knees, and looked to the abbot. Were any tools kept here? Bell mechanisms, pulleys, anything of the kind? None, sir. The tower has been sealed since before my birth. Holmes's eyes darkened. And yet something has found a way to toll. The faint vibration of his words seemed to travel through the stone itself, like the echo of an argument between faith and reason. While Holmes lingered over the remains, my gaze was drawn to a tall candle holder beside the altar, where a drip of hardened wax caught the light in an odd fashion. I moved closer and saw, half buried within the wax, the handle of an iron key. It had fused there as if swallowed by flame, the metal warped and streaked with soot. I called Holmes's attention. He regarded it with keen interest, prizing it free with delicate precision. The surface was blistered, yet beneath the blackened crust gleamed the dull shine of recent use. Curious, he murmured. A key burned into its own vigil. He sniffed the residue and frowned. Soot of a chemical nature, not candle smoke. Some form of ignition has touched this. The wax preserved it from total destruction. The abbot watched, pale and stricken. It belonged to Brother Gregory. It should have opened nothing more sinister than the vestry. Holmes turned the key in his hand, the light sliding across its corroded edges. Yet it bears the scent of fire, not faith, he said softly. When keys melt in devotion, Watson, one suspects the lock was never holy. Holmes spread a sheet of parchment across the stone table, the lantern's glow trembling upon the ink as he worked. Time of death, he said briskly. Brother Andrew, January 4th, 2:15 in the morning. Brother Thomas, January 12th, precisely 2:40. Brother Gregory, January 20th, 2:55. He tapped the page with his pen. Each interval, 8 days, each toll, between 2 and 3, regular, deliberate, inhumanly punctual. The abbot clutched his robe. You mean there is design, premeditation in this horror? Holmes's tone was almost kind. There is always design, abbot. The question is whose? He leaned back, studying the parchment as though it were a confessional page. The hand that kills with precision worships its own logic. There is intellect here, and perhaps penitence disguised as calculation. I watched him, sensing that strange mingling of admiration and dread that his work so often inspired. You believe these deaths to be connected to the bells? I do not believe, Watson, he replied. I deduce. He folded the paper and slid it into his pocket. The tolling marks the rhythm of guilt. It counts not time, but conscience. The lantern flickered again, and in that wavering glow, the 3 dead seemed almost to nod in silent agreement. Holmes took up his cane and began tapping the flagstones one by one, listening as though the abbey itself might reply. Most yielded only the dull thud of age, but when he reached the space before the altar, the sound changed. Lighter, resonant, hollow. He knelt, ear close to the floor, and struck again. There, he said softly. A cavity beneath, likely narrow, perhaps a maintenance shaft or chamber long forgotten. The abbot recoiled. Beneath the tombs? Impossible. Holmes's smile was faint. In my experience, abbot, the impossible merely requires excavation. He pressed his palm to the stone and closed his eyes briefly, as though listening through touch. Air moves here, slow, deliberate, like breath behind a mask. A faint current stirred the candle flame beside him. I shivered. Then someone has been there? Not someone, Watson, he replied. Something. The word echoed faintly through the crypt, swallowed by the silence below. Holmes's observation proved prophetic. As he leaned closer to the flagged floor, a faint vibration reached us, a murmur so delicate that it seemed born of imagination rather than substance. Yet it persisted, rhythmic, metallic, unmistakably real. "It is machinery," Holmes whispered. "Something still in motion." The abbot clutched his crucifix. But beneath the graves, what machine could breathe there? Holmes's eyes shone with grim fascination. A secret one, constructed by hands that sought to fuse science with sacrament. He pressed his ear to the stone again. The faint pulse of the mechanism quickened, then stilled, like a dying heart. "We stand," he said at last, rising, "upon the very threshold of the deception. The bells above and the voices below, both drawn from the same engine of guilt." The abbot murmured a prayer. Holmes did not join him. His gaze was fixed upon the floor, and I knew that behind his calm there stirred a reverence rare in him. Reverence not for faith, but for intellect corrupted by its own brilliance. For a long moment none of us spoke. The air in the crypt seemed charged, as if the unseen mechanism still vibrated with purpose. Holmes stood perfectly still, his expression shadowed by thought. Then, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, he said, "The dead have not spoken, but someone has given them voice." The abbot turned away, his hands trembling. "Blasphemy," he murmured. "To make the sacred instruments of heaven utter the work of man. Blasphemy." Holmes looked up toward the vaulted ceiling, where the faint sound of wind moaned through hidden fissures. "Blasphemy, yes, but born not of disbelief, abbot, only of fear. Guilt builds its own liturgy." He touched the cold stone once more, as if sealing his deduction within it. Whoever built this meant the Abbey to confess what the soul could not. The candles trembled, their flames bowing toward the floor, and for an instant it seemed the dead themselves exhaled through the earth below. The night pressed heavy upon the Abbey, still as a sealed tomb beneath the breath of frost. Though the hour was late, I found no rest in my chamber. The silence, far from soothing, seemed to pulse with memory, the faint echo of those unseen bells, whose spectral tones had wound themselves around my thoughts like a chill fog. Sleep would not come. Each time I closed my eyes, I beheld again the faces of the three dead brothers, so tranquil, yet so subtly marked by violence. The symmetry of their repose haunted me more deeply than the deaths themselves, for in it lay intent, purpose, intelligence. Somewhere beyond the cloisters, a draught moaned softly through the stones, a sound that carried the ghost of music. I turned on my pillow, listening, half in reason and half in dread. Holmes slept, or so I believed. Yet I could not shake the impression that even in his slumber his mind moved restlessly, probing the dark as mine recoiled from it. And so I lay awake, counting the tolls that had not rung, yet still resounded in my heart. The chill of wakefulness drove me from my bed before dawn. Wrapping my coat tight about me, I stepped into the corridor. The air was bitter and motionless, every footfall swallowed by the stone. By instinct more than reason, I turned toward the chapel, drawn by that peculiar stillness which gathers where faith and fear abide together. Inside, the great space lay drowned in shadow, save for a single candle that flickered before the altar, a votive left burning through the night. Its tremulous light played upon the carved oak of the confessional, where the lattice caught the glow like a net for souls. The faint scent of incense still lingered, mingling with the cold odour of damp stone. I stood a while, unwilling to disturb the peace, yet unable to retreat. There was a gravity in that darkness, a sense of presence, as though the very air awaited something spoken, something withheld too long. The flame guttered. The silence seemed almost sentient, drawing breath between the shadows. It was then, as I lingered beside the confessional, that I heard it. The sound of breathing, faint yet human, from behind the lattice. My first thought was of a dream, for no step had crossed the chapel floor. But the sound came again, followed by a whisper so low that it trembled rather than spoke. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." The voice was fragile, uncertain, heavy with the residue of guilt. "The bells. I have made them speak when they should be silent. I have given sound to sin." A chill traced my spine. The speaker's tone wavered between confession and terror. "I meant no harm. I sought only to unearth the buried truth, but the dead, oh God, the dead, would not rest." The whisper cracked into a sob, then steadied. "I used the bells to make them remember. They told for one who still lives." My heart beat violently in the hush that followed. I dared not move, scarcely dared to breathe. Somewhere beyond the lattice, the unseen penitent trembled in darkness, spilling secrets meant for heaven into the ear of an intruder. For a moment, I could not stir. The confession hung in the air between us, half prayer, half indictment. My impulse was to retreat, yet some deeper instinct compelled me to remain. The voice had fallen to a whisper again, shaped more by despair than devotion. "He must know now," it murmured. "The sin cannot stay buried. The bells, they were to awaken him, to make him remember what he did." The words struck me with sudden clarity. This was no plea for forgiveness, but for expiation. The speaker sought not his own salvation, but another's ruin. A sob broke through the stillness. "I thought it would cleanse the Abbey," the voice gasped, "but it has called forth something else, something that answers." My knees felt weak beneath me. I pressed my hand against the wood, yearning to pierce the veil of the screen, to see the face of guilt. But before I could speak, the sound of movement ceased. Only the hollow echo of breath remained, faint as the dying candlelight. The confessional was empty, yet the air seemed alive, whispering its burden still. I turned and nearly cried out, for in the dim light of the chapel's nave stood Holmes. His presence, calm and unannounced, sent through me a shudder more profound than fear. He was neither startled nor curious. His eyes, fixed upon the confessional, shone with that cold illumination which I had come to associate with discovery. "You heard," I whispered. He inclined his head once. "Every syllable." There was a long pause. The candlelight touched his features, revealing a gravity beyond even his usual composure. "It was not chance that brought you here, Watson," he said softly. "The Abbey itself speaks to those who will listen, and sometimes to those who should not." He stepped closer to the confessional, running his gloved fingers along the carved frame. Confession is a curious instrument. It absolves, yet also records. Men whisper their guilt into wood, and wood remembers. He withdrew his hand and looked toward the high window, where a thin dawn began to show. "Come. The night's silence is over. It will be answered by another sound soon enough." His words, I later learned, were prophecy. The Abbey woke to cries before the sun had fully risen. The sound drew us from our rooms with haste, Holmes already dressed, his stride long and certain. We followed the commotion to the base of the tower stair, where a small knot of monks gathered in agitation. There, sprawled upon the cold stone, lay Brother Elias. His face was ashen, his robe torn at the sleeve, his body limp but breathing. A lantern lay shattered beside him, the oil spreading like a dark halo across the floor. The abbot knelt beside him, murmuring prayers that faltered between shock and fear. "He was found here at first light," one of the monks stammered. "We thought he had gone to pray." Holmes bent down, his expression unreadable. "And perhaps he did," he murmured, "but not to the God you serve." He examined the torn sleeve, his hand deft and unhesitating. Beneath the folds of fabric, a faint glint caught the light, something metallic. Holmes's eyes narrowed with recognition. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are closer to our truth than I had hoped, or feared." He rose, his gaze moving toward the belfry above, where the air already seemed to tremble with expectation. Holmes's hand moved swiftly. With a single motion, he drew from the torn sleeve a fine copper wire, no thicker than a strand of hair, coiled like a serpent about the monk's wrist. He examined it in silence, then wound it around his finger and slipped it into his pocket. The abbot, pale and trembling, demanded an explanation, but Holmes merely raised a finger for quiet. "Later, Reverend," he said gently. "For now, your brother still breathes." He turned to me. "Watson, see to him. Keep him from speech if he wakes." I obeyed, though I could not keep my eyes from Holmes. He stood apart, gazing at the tower steps where faint indentations marked recent passage. His lips moved once, as if framing an unspoken hypothesis. At length, he spoke, half to himself. "Some penances," he murmured, "are performed with tools rather than prayers." The abbot stared at him, bewildered. "You mean—" Holmes's eyes darkened. "I mean that repentance may drive a man to invention, and invention, when turned to guilt, becomes its own form of worship." He looked upward to where the sealed belfry loomed above us in the grey light. "Come, Watson, before the next toll sounds, we must know who commands it." The first light of morning fell pale through the cloistered windows, turning the frost upon the panes into 1,000 tiny mirrors. I found Holmes in the tower once more, standing motionless beside the bell ropes. His expression bore that curious stillness which, in him, always heralded revelation. He drew one rope gently between his fingers, studying its frayed fibres with a care more fitting for a physician than a detective. "Note the wear, Watson," he said. "Here, roughened by contact, but only in recent weeks. The Abbey may have slept, but its machinery has not." His voice carried neither triumph nor surprise, only the quiet inevitability of reason fulfilled. "When superstition is stripped of its veil," he continued, "one finds not angels, but apparatus." He turned then, the faint gleam of dawn reflected in his eyes. The bells hung above us, immense and silent, yet the ropes beneath his hand quivered faintly, stirred by the wind, or by something more deliberate. I felt, in that moment, that the mystery had shifted from the realm of the supernatural to something colder still, the domain of man's invention. Later that morning, Holmes obtained from the abbot a small collection of personal effects belonging to Brother Elias. Among them were a set of calipers, a strip of drafting parchment, and a torn receipt bearing the faded heading of Mariner & Co., Telegraphic Apparatus Engineers, London. Holmes examined the fragment with an eagerness sharpened by intuition. "As I suspected," he said, "our brother Elias once worked not in silence, but in signal. This receipt dates from the period when Mariner's firm was engaged upon naval contracts, timed signalling devices designed for remote detonation and coordination." I protested faintly. "Surely, Holmes, you do not suggest—" "I suggest only that genius does not perish when a man takes the robe," he replied. "It merely seeks a nobler disguise." By evening, further inquiry through the local telegraph office confirmed his hypothesis. Elias had left London under peculiar circumstances, his resignation following an explosion in a riverside warehouse that claimed 2 lives. Holmes folded the telegram with care. "Guilt, Watson," he murmured, "is a force of persistence equal to gravity. It draws men inward, to faith, to solitude, to penitence, but rarely to peace." We returned to the lower chamber of the bell tower, where the cold air carried the faint scent of oil and iron. Holmes crouched beside the floorboards, tapping lightly with his cane until a hollow resonance answered. In moments, he had lifted the planks to reveal a narrow recess beneath. There, half buried in dust, lay a compact arrangement of gears and coiled springs, encased within a brass housing tarnished by years of concealment. Holmes's eyes brightened. "A clockwork mechanism, ingenious in its simplicity. Observe the notched wheel, Watson. Each groove corresponds to an interval of 8 days." He traced the components with his finger. "A weight-driven release. The bell ropes connect to these levers, each set to draw and fall in sequence. A mechanical penance, precisely timed, perfectly executed. As he spoke, he turned a key within the device. A faint whir stirred the silence, followed by a soft vibration that seemed to travel through the very walls. The Abbey has not been haunted, he concluded, but wounded. The phrase struck me with quiet horror. There was something dreadful in the notion that death itself could be scheduled by machinery. Holmes replaced the plank with deliberate care, as though sealing the coffin of faith's illusion. When Holmes laid his findings before the abbot, the old man's face blanched as though struck by frost. "You mean to say," he stammered, "that the voice of warning, the toll that has guided our prayers, was no miracle, but a contrivance of steel?" Holmes bowed his head slightly. "I say only that faith, when robbed of evidence, often forges its own." The abbot recoiled as though from blasphemy. "You desecrate the sacred with your science." Holmes's gaze remained steady, almost compassionate. "On the contrary, Reverend, I reveal that your sanctity was exploited by the craft of a man tormented by guilt. Faith need not fear truth. Only falsehood trembles when the light is lit." The abbot sank heavily into his chair, his hands trembling over the rosary at his breast. For a long while he said nothing. Then, in a voice thin as parchment, he whispered, "Then we have prayed over deceit." Holmes inclined his head. Not deceit, perhaps, remorse in mechanical form. Outside, the bells remained mute, but I fancied the air itself carried a faint vibration. A ghost of sound, born not of heaven, but of the clockwork that had impersonated it. That evening, Holmes worked by lamplight in the abbot's study, sketching the diagram of the mechanism with the same precision he once reserved for human anatomy. His movements were rhythmic, almost reverent. The page filled with lines and annotations, ratchet, axle, escapement, until the device, once hidden beneath the Abbey floor, seemed to live again in graphite and thought. I stood by the window, watching snow drift against the darkened panes. "You have conquered the impossible once more," I said. He looked up briefly. "Conquered? No, Watson, merely interpreted. Nature is never conquered, only translated." There was something austere in his tone, almost mournful. As his pencil moved, the Abbey itself seemed to grow colder. The mystery had been explained, yes, but not extinguished. In stripping the veil from the supernatural, Holmes had revealed a human sorrow far deeper than myth. I wondered whether science, in banishing fear, sometimes left in its place a more desolate truth, that man's ingenuity could rival God in cruelty as well as design. Holmes set down his pencil and folded the sketch. "There," he said quietly, "the anatomy of a delusion." Holmes sat long in thought, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Elias was not drawn here by faith alone," he said at last. "He sought confinement, not absolution. The Abbey was his prison, not his refuge." I recalled the confession I had overheard in the chapel, the voice trembling with both fear and penance. Then his guilt drove him to recreate the very device that had once destroyed. Precisely, to atone through repetition, he rebuilt his sin, but in sacred form. Holmes's eyes gleamed with sombre understanding. He gave the Abbey its miracle, the illusion of divine voice. Each toll was both punishment and confession. The man condemned himself through his invention. The theory struck me with a deep melancholy. "And yet," I said, "no one suspected." Holmes smiled faintly. "Because mankind prefers mystery to explanation and devotion to accountability." He rose and crossed to the window. The dawn wind stirred faintly, carrying the smell of iron and cold. Elias sought forgiveness from the one judge who never answers, himself. There was no triumph in Holmes's tone, only pity. We returned once more to the belfry. The mechanism lay dormant now, its gears stilled, its ropes slack, like veins drained of life. Holmes stood before it, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes distant. "You see, Watson," he said, "we have explained the sound, but not the purpose. The bells rang for more than guilt." I looked to him in perplexity. "You mean there was another motive?" "Perhaps." His gaze travelled upward to the great bells, black against the morning light. To awaken conscience or to preserve it, to remind the living of what the dead conceal. He reached out and touched the rope nearest him. It swayed gently in the draught, emitting a faint, hollow murmur. Even now, the air remembers. His expression softened, the fierce intellect yielding to something almost human. Science, my dear Watson, can unmask the cause of a phenomenon, but it cannot answer why a man would choose to resurrect his own damnation. The wind rose, stirring the ropes into subtle motion, their fibres whispering like nerves rekindled. Holmes turned away. "Come," he said quietly. "There remains one bell that has not yet rung, and I suspect it tolls for the living." It was near midnight when Holmes and I at last retired to our narrow chamber. The chill of the Abbey had settled deep into the stone walls, and even the flame of the lamp quivered as if reluctant to live. Holmes had been long silent, his brow furrowed in that meditative stillness which, in him, bordered upon reverence. I had just begun to doze when the air shuddered with a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The bell. It tolled once, low, immense and resonant, rolling across the frozen courtyards like the voice of judgment itself. We were on our feet instantly. Holmes's coat was upon him before I had fully gathered my senses. "The mechanism was dismantled," he said under his breath. "Therefore what tolls now does so by a human hand or by will." We hurried down the corridor, the echo still quivering in the timbers overhead. Outside, the courtyard was awash in moonlight, and the frost gleamed like powdered glass. Somewhere beyond the cloisters, the bell's single cry seemed to linger, unresolved, as though waiting for an answer that the living could not give. Holmes led the way through the cloister arch, his lantern casting a trembling circle of light upon the snow. The night had fallen utterly still. Even the wind seemed frozen in its flight. There, upon the fresh whiteness, a line of footprints traced a solitary path across the square. "They are recent," Holmes murmured. "The edges unblurred, the compression uniform. One person, light, deliberate, moving without hesitation." We followed in silence. The prints wound their way past the refectory wall and into the open garden beyond the chapel. The air here carried a strange tension, as if the Abbey itself were holding its breath. At the far edge of the cloister, where the shadows of the tower stretched long upon the snow, the trail came to rest. I felt Holmes's pace slow beside me. "There," he said softly, and lifted the lantern higher. The light fell upon a figure kneeling in the drift, solitary, unmoving, her garments stiff with frost. Around her shoulders clung the black veil of the convent, glimmering faintly in the moonlight. "She has come to pray," I whispered. Holmes's reply was scarcely audible, or to atone. Beneath the shadow of the bell tower knelt Sister Ruth. Her hands were clasped so tightly that the abbot's rosary had bitten into the flesh of her fingers, the beads gleaming like frozen tears. Her lips moved soundlessly, but her breath rose in pale wisps that fluttered like the remnants of prayer. She seemed not to notice our approach. The moonlight lay across her face, and in that cold radiance I saw the exhaustion of a soul too long burdened. Holmes stood still beside me, his gaze fixed not upon her, but upon the faint copper glint that gleamed from beneath her cloak. "Speak softly, Watson," he murmured. "The confession has begun." For a moment I believed she would not stir at all. Then, with a shuddering sigh, she raised her eyes. They were luminous, hollow, and strangely calm. "He hears me now," she whispered. "The one who condemned the innocent. The bell has told him the truth." Holmes inclined his head, his voice measured and low. "Sister Ruth, whose sin do you toll for?" "The dead." or the living? Her reply came scarcely above the wind. Both. And then she bowed her head once more, as though her prayer had become a verdict. Holmes's words seemed to unlock something within her. Her voice, once tremulous, gathered strength, not in defiance, but in release. Years ago, she began, before the Abbey's silence there was a man, young, devoted, accused of theft from the cloister treasury. The abbot swore his guilt before the magistrate. He was hanged at dawn, protesting his innocence until the rope silenced him. That man was my brother. The confession struck me like a blow. The snowflakes drifted between us, pale and soundless, yet each seemed heavy as lead. I took the veil, she continued, not for piety, but for punishment. I swore that the truth would ring one day where words had failed. The abbot's prayers could not summon it, so I found another voice. The bell. Holmes's expression remained still, though I felt the tightening of his breath. And you believe its toll would rouse the conscience of the guilty? I believed it might make God listen where men did not. The wind stirred, carrying the faint groan of the tower above. But conscience, she whispered, is a crueler bell. Once it rings, it cannot be silenced. Her shoulders shook, and for the first time I saw that the weight she bore was not vengeance, but remorse. Her next words came through tears. It was Brother Elias who built the device. He told me once that guilt could be measured by sound, that the bell might speak where the soul dared not. When he died, I found his notes, his sketches, his key. She drew from her cloak a small brass instrument, blackened by age and frost. I only meant to make it speak again, for truth, for justice. But when the first toll sounded, it was not the abbot who woke. It was the Abbey itself. She pressed her hands to her ears. Every night it grew louder. I tried to stop it, but I could not. The sound was in the walls, in the air, in me. It called his name, and mine. Holmes knelt before her, studying the mechanism with a physician's calm. You built remorse into motion, sister, he said gently. It is a common design among the living. She gave a hollow laugh. I only wanted the truth to be heard. The truth, Holmes murmured, never tolls without cost. Her hands fell limp, the brass device dropping into the snow like a relic unworthy of its faith. For a long while, Holmes said nothing. The lantern flame wavered between them, casting their shadows against the whitened ground. Hers bowed, his upright, both etched in the same fragile light. Then, without a word, he drew aside her cloak. Beneath the folds, coiled about her wrist, gleamed the same fine copper wire that had once bound Brother Elias. Its sheen caught the lamplight, glimmering with the beauty of an instrument designed for penance. Holmes traced it with his gloved finger, not as accuser but as mourner. The same hand that created the voice of guilt, he murmured, has now passed it on. She met his gaze, her lips trembling. I wanted him to remember, she whispered. Holmes's eyes softened, though his words were steady. And so you became his conscience. The lantern flickered. A faint wind stirred the tower's cords above. Holmes rose slowly, the coil of wire dangling from his hand like a question without answer. He did not condemn her, nor forgive. His silence was its own judgment, heavier than any word could bear. The sound of hurried steps broke the stillness. From the archway emerged the abbot, his robe dishevelled, his face ashen with alarm. "Sister Ruth!" he gasped, his voice quivering between command and fear. At sight of him, she sank to her knees anew. "Father," she cried, "it was I who made the bells speak." He stopped short, the lantern light falling across his features, revealing something beyond horror. Recognition. "You," he breathed. "You knew." "I knew," she said. "I knew what you had done to my brother. I heard your false oath. I saw the rope tighten." Holmes watched in silence, his eyes fixed upon the abbot's trembling hands. The old man's voice broke. "You think I did not suffer?" His death saved the Abbey. It saved souls. It saved your reputation, Holmes said quietly. The abbot turned, startled by the calmness of the tone. You cannot understand. On the contrary, Holmes replied, I understand too well. There are sins that reason excuses, but conscience never pardons. The abbot's head fell into his hands. The snow thickened around him, muting his sobs until they were indistinguishable from the wind itself. Dawn crept slowly across the Abbey grounds, a pale wash of light dissolving the shadows. The bells hung motionless now, their ropes limp and silent. Ruth sat in quiet resignation, her eyes fixed upon the horizon where night gave way to absolution. Holmes stood beside me, his face unreadable, his thoughts veiled. The machinery is cold, he said softly. And yet, listen. At first I heard nothing. Then, faint and distant, there came a single sound, a deep, solitary toll that rolled across the valley. We turned as one toward the tower. The ropes hung still. The gears lay open, lifeless, and yet the sound had been unmistakable. The abbot crossed himself, his face pale as the snow. It is a sign, he whispered. Holmes's eyes remained upon the sky, where the sun's first rays touched the highest bell. Perhaps, he murmured, or perhaps guilt is an echo that outlives its cause. The sound faded, leaving only silence. In that silence, I could not tell whether the Abbey had found peace, or simply another kind of haunting. Dawn crept slowly across the horizon, laying a pale gold upon the snowbound stones of the Abbey. The night's long torments had at last given way to a morning so still that even the crows upon the tower seemed reluctant to speak. From the courtyard below came the muted labour of workmen, their ropes taut, their breaths white in the cold, as the first of the great bells was lowered from its place of dominion. It descended not with ceremony, but with a quiet so absolute that each creak of the pulleys seemed an intrusion upon eternity. The monks stood in solemn line, their heads bowed, yet no prayer rose to meet the moment. Only the sound of metal against frost marked the passing of what had once been their voice to heaven. Holmes watched from the archway, his coat drawn close about him. His expression was unreadable, neither satisfaction nor triumph, but a kind of reverence for the gravity of the act. The Abbey had chosen silence as its penance, and in that silence I fancied I could still hear the faint memory of the bell's toll, not in sound, but in the heart's uneasy echo. Upon the frozen ground lay the dismantled bells, vast and inert, their bronze surfaces dulled to the colour of ash. They seemed no longer instruments of devotion, but relics of confession, each scar, each fissure, a record of the years they had ruled the air. Holmes regarded them with the detachment of a scholar before an ancient text. Curious, Watson, he said at length, brushing his gloved hand along one of the bell's rims. Men have always forged their guilt into sound. Each note is but a cry to drown out thought. There was a strange gentleness in his voice as he spoke, the tone of a man not deriding belief, but tracing its frailty. Every instrument of penance, my dear fellow, is of human design. Even sanctity demands engineering. I bent beside him, examining the faint indentation of a maker's mark upon the metal. The name was eroded by time, yet I could just discern the Latin for redemption. Holmes's eyes followed mine. How fitting, he murmured. The craftsman believed he was forging grace itself, and yet wrought the machinery of torment. He turned away, and the echo of his words lingered like a bell that refused to fade. When the final bell had been lowered and the tower stood hollow against the sky, the abbot emerged from the cloister. His step was slow, his figure diminished, as though age had overtaken him in a single night. In his hands he carried a small silver cross, its surface darkened by the chill. He paused before the empty belfry and raised his trembling hand in benediction. The monks gathered close, their breath mingling in the cold air like incense. His voice, when it came, was faint, not the command of a shepherd, but the confession of a soul stripped bare. Faith, he said, is a bell rung by the heart. When guilt has touched it, the tone is no longer true. So let this silence cleanse what sound has stained. Holmes stood beside me, head slightly inclined. For once he neither spoke nor wrote, but listened, as if the abbot's frail words contained the measure of a truth he had long pursued, but never named. When the blessing ended, the abbot let his hand fall. The silver cross slipped from his grasp, landing softly in the snow. None moved to retrieve it. It seemed a relic already, a symbol consecrated by renunciation rather than faith. As the carts departed, bearing their burden of disused bells, a deep calm settled upon the Abbey grounds. The air, cleansed of sound, seemed almost purer for its restraint. Holmes stood watching the last wagon wheel vanish beyond the gate, his gaze distant, his profile touched by the pale winter sun. "Do you know, Watson," he said after a long pause, "why man adorns his temples with bells?" I shook my head. "To remind himself that he possesses a conscience," he replied. "For when the inner voice falters, he creates another to echo its reproach. Each toll proclaims not faith, but fear, a fear of silence in which his soul might hear itself too clearly." He drew a slow breath, his eyes fixed upon the horizon. "We craft sound to disguise our own stillness. And when conscience grows mute, we invent noise to punish its absence." His words carried no cynicism, only a weary compassion. It struck me then that Holmes, for all his intellect, felt deeply the tragedy of human striving, that endless attempt to construct redemption by mechanism, to translate morality into machinery. The wind rose faintly, and in it I fancied a sigh, not of judgment, but of release. Later that day we were summoned to the small smithy adjoining the Abbey. Within, the final bell, the largest of them all, rested upon a stone bed, awaiting its transformation. The forge blazed with steady heat, casting long shadows that trembled upon the soot-stained walls. Holmes stood beside the master smith as the molten flame bit into the bronze. Slowly, the great shape yielded, its solemn curves collapsing into a molten tide. The air filled with a faint hiss, as if the metal itself were sighing in surrender. "From mourning to measurement," Holmes murmured. "What once marked death shall now govern time." The smith nodded toward a table where small gears and cogs were arranged in meticulous order. "It will serve the Abbey clock, sir," he said, "that it may strike the hours once more." Holmes's lips curved in faint approval. "A fitting transmutation. The dead are silent. Let the living keep count." When the bell's last fragment disappeared into flame, I felt an odd melancholy, as though a soul had been dissolved, not redeemed. The soundless blaze devoured sanctity itself, leaving only the hum of human purpose. By sunset, the Abbey clock stood restored, its ancient face gleaming faintly through the twilight mist. Holmes and I watched as the smith adjusted the final gear, then withdrew. A hush lingered, that brief expectancy before an engine speaks its first word. Then came the sound. 1, 2, 3 deliberate strokes, not mournful, not exalted, but measured, exact, indifferent. Holmes inclined his head. "No lament, no prayer," he said softly. "Only time, impartial and eternal." The monks had gathered at a distance, their faces lit by the fading light. None crossed themselves, none wept. The sound that replaced the bells carried neither penitence nor faith, but something starker, the pulse of reason. As the last note faded, Holmes turned to me. "The Abbey will endure," he said, "not because it believes, but because it remembers." His tone was one of resignation, almost tenderness. In that moment, the great clock seemed not merely to count the hours, but to forgive them. That night, as we prepared to leave, I found Holmes standing alone in the courtyard. The sky was veiled in low, drifting cloud, and the empty tower loomed like a monument to silence. He did not speak when I approached. His gaze was fixed upon the hollow space where the bells had hung, as though listening for a sound that reason could not restore. When at last he turned to me, his expression bore that rare, haunted gravity I had seen only after cases where guilt was entwined with faith. "There are," he said quietly, "sins which no deduction can absolve." I could find no answer. The wind moved softly through the arches, carrying with it the faintest, impossible echo, a single note suspended between logic and the soul. As the carriage rolled away from the Abbey, Holmes sat in unbroken silence, his gaze fixed upon the fading outline of the tower against the pallid sky. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "man invents his miracles because he cannot bear his conscience unspoken. The bells were never divine, only human guilt echoing through metal. Yet," he added softly, "perhaps that is miracle enough. Tell me, what do you believe haunted the Abbey more? The sin that was buried, or the conscience that refused to stay silent? Share your thoughts below. And if this mystery stirred your curiosity, subscribe for more of Holmes's cases. And share this story with those who still listen for truth in silence.